You don't plan for situations like these. They creep up on you, quiet and inconspicuous, until your entire world alters and nothing seems the same. It was a typical Tuesday night. Dinner was simple: roast chicken, steamed veggies, and a bottle of red wine that Dean opened but didn't consume much of. He was constantly preoccupied, glued to his phone or engrossed in work, even at supper. Sebastian had only been living with us for a few months, yet his presence altered everything. At 27, he was still attempting to sort out his life, having returned home following a disastrous business endeavor. Dean believed he was being responsible by giving his kid a space to recuperate. I envisioned it as a volatile situation, poised to explode under the pressure of their divergent expectations. The inadvertent contact occurred in the middle of supper. My foot slid beneath the table and brushed against Seb's leg. It was a brief time that shouldn't have mattered, but the way his dark and penetrating eyes stared at me afterwards left me breathless. I told myself it was only a mistake, a passing moment, but it did not. That contact remained, tormenting me long after the dishes had been cleaned and the house was still. Even though I tried to dismiss it, I couldn't escape the sensation that something had changed between us. This narrative recounts how a single incident fundamentally altered my understanding of myself, my marriage, and the delicate balance between morality and immorality. It's fascinating how your life can feel both full and empty at the same moment. That's how I frequently characterize my marriage with Dean. He's a decent man by any conventional standard, successful, steady, and reliable. But this stability has always come at a cost. There was a gap between us that no amount of time together could manage to overcome. Dean and I met at a design show 15 years ago. I was there proofreading a freelance essay on upcoming architectural trends as he was showing one of his firm's projects. He swept me off my feet with his confidence and ambition, creating a picture of a future that seemed to include me. I believed I'd finally discovered someone who could be a true companion. Dean's universe narrowed with time, occupied by deadlines, clients, and designs. I became a supportive figure in his life. I played the act so effectively that I began to forget who I was before him. When Dean's kid, Sebastian, returned home, he brought a new dimension to our already precarious equilibrium. Sebastian, or Seb as I'd come to call him, was 27 years old and struggling with an unspoken failure. Dean's business, a tech venture he eagerly financed, had failed after less than a year. I didn't know the specifics, only that it left Seb perplexed and Dean quietly dissatisfied. "Give him time," Dean said one evening as we sat in the living room. "He's figuring it out." "Time will not solve everything," I said, my tone rougher than I intended. Dean gave me a glance, his brow furrowed. "He's my son, Elise. He requires our help." I nodded, swallowing back a reply that was on the tip of my lips. Seb wasn't an effortless presence around the house. He spent the majority of his time locked up in his room, emerging only for meals and the occasional late-night beverage. When we did interact, it was cordial but cautious, as if we were both waiting for each other to make the first move. I attempted to connect with him in tiny ways, like laying new towels on his bed and preparing his favorite meals, but he never appeared to notice. Or if he did, he didn't admit it. Still, there were times when I caught glimpses of the guy he used to be. For example, when he played the piano in the evenings, his fingers glided smoothly over the keys, filling the home with music that felt too large for its walls. In such moments, I felt a glimmer of something I couldn't quite identify. Everything seemed normal the night it happened. Dean had worked late as usual, so I was left to make supper on my own. I cooked chicken, prepared veggies, and opened a bottle of red wine that I knew Dean would only drink one before putting away. Seb arrived downstairs just as I was preparing the meal. His hair looked as if he had just rolled out of bed. "Smells good," he added, his voice low. "Thanks," I said with a slight smile. Dean came soon after, loosening his tie as he went through the door. He kissed my cheek as he apologized for being late. We sat down together, which is unusual these days, and began eating in quiet, with the only sounds being the clinking of silverware and the odd rustle of Dean's phone as he checked his messages. It occurred midway through the dinner. I shifted in my position, extending my legs beneath the table, and my foot touched something warm. I froze, recognizing only too late that it was Seb's leg. "Sorry," I said, taking my foot back. "It's okay," Seb said swiftly, his voice calm but his gaze drawn to mine. The moment passed quickly, yet I couldn't ignore the charge in the air. I was hyper-aware of him during the lunch, the way he shifted in his seat, the way his fingers tapped softly on the table. He glanced at me when he thought I wasn't looking. After dinner, Dean went to his office to catch up on work, leaving it to me to clean the table. Seb stayed in the kitchen, resting against the counter, while I filled the dishwasher. "Dinner was fine," he remarked, his voice lower than normal. "Thank you," I responded without looking up. There was a tense moment. I felt his gaze on me, and when I finally turned to face him, I noticed something in his look that made my breath catch. He looked aside immediately and cleared his throat. He muttered, "Good night," and disappeared up the stairs before I could react. That night, when I lay in bed near Dean, I couldn't stop thinking about the time beneath the table. It was such a minor, brief event, yet it seemed like the start of something I couldn't quite identify. I convinced myself I was imagining it, and that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew better. The days that followed were a jumble of avoidance and brief looks. Seb and I danced around each other, our exchanges filled with unsaid tension, something none of us seems eager to confront. I became hyper-aware of his presence in a way that both excited and worried me. The sound of his footsteps on the stairs, the aroma of his cologne lingering in the corridor, the way his voice softened when he talked to me. All of this felt exaggerated, difficult to overlook. Dean ignored the undercurrents in the home and proceeded to bury himself in work. He left early in the morning and returned late at night, often too weary to accomplish more than exchange pleasantries before retiring to bed. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening as we sat on the couch. "Just tired," I said, attempting a grin. He nodded, engrossed by the emails on his phone. Several nights later, I found myself in the kitchen, unable to sleep. I was pouring a glass of water when I saw footsteps behind me. "Can't sleep?" Seb inquired, his voice quiet. I turned to see him standing at the doorway. His hair's look is unreadable. Ence was inscrutable. Something like that, I responded. He moved closer and leaned on the counter. "Same here." For a minute, none of us spoke. The quiet between us was dense, weighted with what we were not saying. "About the other night," Seb began, but his voice trailed off. "It was nothing," I said hastily, my heart beating. "Was that it?" he questioned, his gaze fixed on mine. I opened my lips to reply. However, no words came. After that late-night meeting in the kitchen, the home became unbearably tense. Seb and I avoided directly acknowledging what had happened between us, but it persisted beneath every word, gaze, and breath. I tried to tell myself that it was all in my imagination, a product of my overactive thoughts and lonely heart. But deep down, I knew better. It was a Saturday morning and unusually warm for April. Dean had departed early for a site inspection. leaving Seb and I alone in the house. I remained in my room for longer than normal, attempting to escape the unpleasantness of sharing the same place. But hunger soon overcame out, and I went downstairs to prepare breakfast. Seb was already present, sitting on the kitchen island with a mug of coffee and his laptop open in front of him. He glanced up as I arrived. His expression was unreadable. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning," I responded, keeping my tone light. I occupied myself with the stove, aiming to keep the contact quick. But as the minutes passed, I felt his eyes on me, heavy and seeking. "Do you want eggs?" I inquired, my voice too loud. "Sure," he said, placing his drink down. The stillness stretched while I scrambled the eggs, with the only sound being the faint sizzle of the pan. I could feel the tension tightening and crushing down on me like a weight. As we ate, I tried to make small chat by asking him about his plans for today. He responded in short terms. His customary aloofness was accentuated by something I couldn't quite identify. Finally, he put his fork down and glanced at me, his expression serious. "Elise," he continued, his voice gentle but steady, "can we discuss what's happened?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "There is nothing to talk about," I said hurriedly, my words rushing out. His brow wrinkled, and fury flashed over his features. "You keep repeating this, but it isn't true. We both know it isn't." "Seb, I'm not trying to make this harder for you," he interrupted, his tone calmer now, "but I can't keep pretending nothing has happened." I gazed at him, my heart racing. "It was an accident," I explained, my voice wavering. "That's all it was." He shook his head, his expression resolute. "It wasn't only about the touch, Elise. It has been everything since then. We avoid each other, and you gaze at me." My lips opened to argue, but no words came out. Later that afternoon, I decided to leave the home, believing that a change of environment would help clear my thoughts. I went to the park, a peaceful spot I frequent when I wanted to ponder. I did not anticipate Seb to follow me. I was seated on a bench looking at the tiny pond in the park's center when I heard his voice. "Mind if I join you?" he inquired. I looked up, surprised to see him standing there with his hands pushed into the pockets of his jacket. "Sure," I answered after a while, moving over to make room. He sat next to me, his shoulder touching mine momentarily. We didn't speak for a while. We observed the ducks gliding over the water. Their motions are calm and leisurely. Seb eventually broke the stillness, saying, "This used to be my favorite spot." "Really?" He nodded. "When I was younger, my mother would bring me here. We'd sit at the pond for hours, feeding the ducks and discussing everything and nothing." His voice sounded forlorn and vulnerable, something I hadn't noticed previously. "I miss her," he said gently. I felt pity, and my chest tightened. "She would be proud of you, you know." He chuckled harshly and shaken his head. "I doubt it." "She would," I insisted. "You are intelligent, talented, and resilient. She'd notice that." Seb turned to face me, his eyes softening. "You are the only one who thinks so." The sun was setting, throwing gold and pink hues across the park. I stood and brushed my hands. "We should go back." Seb nodded, but before I could move, he grabbed my hand, halting my progress. "Elise," he whispered, his voice low. I turned to face him, my pulse racing. "Thank you," he remarked, his gaze fixed on mine. "Thanks for being there. Thank you for viewing me." Before I could react, he released my hand, his contact lingering even after he walked away. That night, I was unable to sleep. I lay awake, my mind racing with memories of Seb and that moment in the park. Around midnight, I walked downstairs for some water, thinking that the cool air would help clear my mind. I wasn't expecting to see Seb sitting on the couch, holding a glass of whiskey. "Can't sleep?" he inquired, his voice low and harsh. "No," I confessed, crossing the room to sit near him. For a long time we sat in quiet, the only sound being the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall. Seb eventually spoke up, barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking about the park." I turned to face him, my chest constricting. "Seb?" "I know it's wrong," he murmured, his words coming out quickly. "I understand we shouldn't, but I can't stop feeling this way." My breath caught, and I experienced a flood of emotions, including terror. Guilt and yearning collide at once. "Seb, we can't," I murmured, my voice quivering. "It's not correct." "Why not?" he inquired, his gaze seeking me. "Why can't we be honest about our feelings?" I did not have an answer. He drew closer, his gaze flickering to my lips before returning to my eyes. "Elise," he said, his voice cracking. And then, before I could stop him or myself, I bridged the gap between us. The kiss was quick and hesitant. However, it seemed like the culmination of every whispered word, stolen glance, an instant that had brought us here. When it was over, we both stood back, breathless and bewildered. I apologized hastily, up and stepping away from him. "Don't be," he said, for everything. Lie, his gaze following me. But I was. I apologized for everything. The kiss, the emotions I couldn't control, and the boundary we just crossed. In the days after that kiss, the home seemed like a cage. Every corner brimmed with the weight of what we'd accomplished. I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, yet it felt akin to balancing on a narrow ledge, with each stride escalating in danger. Seb and I didn't talk about it openly, but the air between us was heavy with unsaid words, and the tension got worse with each passing day. Dean, clueless as ever, proceeded to bury himself in his work, his presence in the house a mere shadow rather than a reality. He would leave early, return late, and spend most evenings in his office, poring over plans and spreadsheets. Even his absence wasn't enough to alleviate my shame. I attempted to avoid Seb as much as possible. I began leaving the house early, going for lengthy walks, or spending hours at the library on the premise of wanting a change of scenery. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake my thoughts or the memories of that night. One afternoon, I was coming from one of my self-imposed exiles. I discovered Seb in the kitchen, cutting veggies for dinner. "You have been out a lot recently," he added without looking up. "I just wanted some fresh air," I said, attempting to seem nonchalant. He looked at me, his expression unclear. "You don't have to avoid me, you understand?" "I am not avoiding you," I said, too fast. He grinned and laid the knife down. "Right?" I felt my cheeks heat and started to go, but his words interrupted me. Elise whispered quietly, and the way he uttered my name broke my heart. I hesitated with my back to him. "I'm not sorry for what occurred," he said. "Are you in?" I didn't respond. I could not. Instead, I walked away, feeling my chest tighten with each step. Dean eventually noticed the shift in the dynamics of the home. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening as we sat at the dinner table. I shrugged, keeping my gaze on my plate, simply exhausted. Dean nodded, but his stare remained on me for longer than usual. Later that night, as I was preparing for bed, he arrived at the doorway of our bedroom. "Is everything okay?" he inquired cautiously. "Of course," I responded, feigning a grin. He paused, looking into my eyes. "You'd tell me if something was wrong, right?" "Of course," I said, my voice firm despite the tempest brewing within me. He nodded slowly, but I could see hesitation in his eyes. One night, unable to sleep, I walked downstairs to prepare tea. The home was silent, almost uncomfortable. I was adding water to the kettle when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Seb standing at the doorway, his expression inscrutable. "Couldn't sleep?" he inquired, his voice low. I shook my head, my heart racing. He went into the kitchen, his presence making it difficult to breathe. "Elise," he continued, his voice quiet yet forceful, "we can't keep pretending that nothing is occurring." I placed down the teapot, my hands quivering. "Seb, please." "No," he answered, moving closer. "I need to say something." He paused, looking into my eyes. "I care for you more than I should, and I know it's confusing, but I can't ignore my feelings." His comments had a profound impact on me, rendering me momentarily speechless. My voice trembled as I finally responded, "Seb, this is not right." "Maybe not," he responded, "but it is genuine." The next day, I met my friend Margaret for coffee. She was one of the few individuals who had supported me during the ups and downs of my marriage. Her keen wit and no-nonsense approach provided both comfort and stress. She looked at me over the rim of her cup and remarked, "You seem distracted." "Just a lot on my mind," I said, stirring my tea. She lifted her eyebrow. "Is there anything you wish to talk about?" "No, I spoke too soon." Her eyes narrowed and her stare was penetrating. "You know, you are a horrible liar." I chuckled awkwardly and shook my head. "It is nothing, really." Margaret sat back in her seat, her look suspicious. "Whatever it is, take care. Secrets often surface unexpectedly." Her remarks remained with me long after we parted ways. Dean planned to organize a modest family reunion the next weekend, a backyard BBQ for the three of us and a few of his co-workers. I spent the day preparing meals, constantly balancing the logistics of entertaining with the ongoing tension between Seb and me. As the guests came, I smiled and settled into the usual rhythm of playing hostess. But no matter how hard I tried to concentrate on the talk, I couldn't escape the sense that something was going to go wrong. It occurred around the end of the evening. Most of the visitors had departed, and Dean was in the kitchen cleaning up. Seb and I were outdoors, grabbing the remaining dishes from the patio table. As I reached for a dish, my fingers brushed across his, causing a thrill through me. "Elise," he whispered gently, just above a whisper. I froze, my heart racing. Before I could react, Dean walked outdoors, his gaze narrowing as he took in the surroundings. "What's happening here?" he inquired, his tone harsh. "Nothing," I answered hurriedly, backing back. Dean's eyes darted between us, mistrust coloring his countenance. "You guys have been acting strangely recently," he continued, his voice strained. "Dean, you're just imagining things," I said, attempting to keep my voice calm. "Am I?" He fired back, his gaze sharpening. The hush that ensued was deafening. That night I lay awake with Dean's mistrust weighing on me like a tangible force. I knew the truth would eventually come out. Seb, too, was on edge, his customary confidence replaced with a subtle anxiety that I hadn't seen previously. We were on a collision path, with no way to avoid it. Secrets have a tendency of becoming heavier with time, like stones in your pocket while you walk through deep water. Every step feels tougher. Every breath becomes tighter. I believed I could bear my burden forever, but as time passed, I realized that the truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how deeply you attempt to bury it. The kiss with Seb felt like a splinter I couldn't get out. It festered in every quiet moment, infiltrating my thoughts unexpectedly. I repeated it endlessly, the warmth of his lips, the way his hand lingered on mine, and the way he muttered my name as if it meant something. What bothered me the most was the sight in his eyes afterwards. Hope, desire, and something more I couldn't quite describe. I told myself that it had to end. That night, I resolved to myself that it would not happen again. But the more I attempted to remove myself, the closer we appeared to get. A few days after the BBQ, I found myself in the kitchen early one morning, looking blankly at the coffee maker as it sputtered and hissed. Dean had already departed for work. His disappearance is a comfort. Seb entered a few minutes later, his hair still nussed from sleep. He was dressed casually in a basic gray t-shirt and sweatpants, yet something about his demeanor drew me in. "Morning," he murmured, his voice heavy with sleep. "Morning," I said, my gaze fixed on the coffee pot. For a minute we stood silently, the tension between us obvious. He eventually said softly, "Elise." I turned to face him, my chest constricting as he looked at me. "I can't keep doing this," he remarked quietly but firmly, pretending there's nothing wrong. "There's nothing wrong," I said immediately, though my voice lacked confidence. He moved closer, his stare never leaving mine. "You do not believe that any more than I do." I opened my lips to answer, but the words stayed in my throat. Later that afternoon, I took a stroll to clear my mind. The park had become my haven, a location where I could pretend, if only for a short while, that my life was not crumbling. I sat on a seat near the pond and watched the ducks skim over the water. The spring weather was pleasant, with the aroma of budding flowers lingering in the breeze. I was so deep in thinking that I didn't notice Seb approaching until he said, "Mind if I join you?" I looked up, surprised to see him standing there. "Sure," I answered after a while, moving over to make room. He sat down alongside me, his shoulder brushing against mine. We didn't speak for a while. The quiet between us was full of unspoken words. He eventually spoke quietly. "I've been thinking." "What is this about?" I inquired, even though I already knew. He spoke about us, whose attention was riveted on the pond. "So, what happened?" I felt my chest tighten, the weight of his words pressing against me. "It can't happen again," I murmured, my voice quivering. "Why not?" he questioned, turning to face me. "Because it is incorrect." I spoke, but the words seemed hollow. Seb shook his head, his face a combination of irritation and regret. "Do you actually believe that?" "Yes," I said while my voice faltered. He reached for my hand, and his contact sent shocks through me. "Elise, I care about you, more than I should, and I believe you agree." I drew my hand away, tears burning my eyes. "Seb, please do not do this." That evening, Dean arrived home earlier than usual. His presence reminded me of the life I was destined to live. As he stepped into the kitchen, he gave me a quick kiss on the cheek. "What's for dinner?" he inquired, his tone diverted. "Roast chicken," I said, attempting a grin. He nodded, already thumbing through his phone. As we ate, I found myself staring at him, hoping to see any resemblance to the man I had married all those years before. But he was a stranger to me now, his gaze constantly elsewhere. For the first time, I wondered if he noticed our growing gap or cared. 2 nights later, the situation escalated. It began with a simple query. Dean had worked late again, and I was tidying up after supper when he stepped in with a strained frown. "We need to discuss," he added in a tight tone. "What is this about?" I inquired, as my gut twisted with anxiety. He narrowed his eyes as he spoke about you and Seb. I froze, my heart racing. "What about us?" "Don't play stupid." "Elise," he snapped, "I've noticed the way he looks at you and how you've been acting recently. Something is going on." "You're being ridiculous," I responded hastily, my voice shaking. "Am I?" He shot back and moved closer, because it does not feel that way. The dispute heated up fast, with his charges becoming stronger with each syllable. "Do you even love me anymore?" he demanded, his voice cracking. I looked at him, my chest constricting. "Dean, I don't." He interrupted me. "Do not lie to me." The audience fell silent for a moment, the impact of his words lingering in the air. "I'm not sure," I answered finally, my voice barely above a whisper. His face sank, the wrath drained from his countenance and replaced by something else, which I couldn't quite place. Dean exited that night, slamming the door behind him. I did not try to stop him. Seb discovered me sitting on the couch, face buried in my hands. "He understands," I murmured, my voice shaking. Seb sat alongside me, his hand gently resting on my shoulder. "What happens now?" he said, his voice quiet. "I don't know," I acknowledged, "but it won't be easy." That night, as I lay awake in bed, I found myself rehearsing our quarrel, Dean's comments reverberating in my head. "Do you even love me anymore?" The fact was that I didn't know. I wasn't sure whether I'd ever done it, or if I'd just convinced myself that I had, since it was simpler than acknowledging the opposite. What I did know was that my life was disintegrating, and there was no turning back. When you've kept a secret long enough, it begins to shape you. It revolves around your decisions, whispers in your silences, standing between you and others who believe they know you. That night, when Dean departed, I felt the full impact of my decisions. Seb's presence beside me on the couch should have provided comfort, but instead, it reminded me of the delicate boundary we had crossed. I wasn't sure we'd be able to recover from this phrase. The following morning, I awoke to an empty home. Dean had not returned, and Seb was nowhere to be seen. The hush was stifling. It wrapped over me like a thick blanket. I carried out my daily routine, which included taking a bath, preparing coffee, and cleaning the kitchen. But everything seemed strange, as if I were living someone else's life. I kept checking my phone, half anticipating Dean's message, but the screen remained black. Part of me wanted to contact him and attempt to explain, but I had no idea where to begin. What could I say that wouldn't make matters worse? It wasn't until late afternoon that Seb returned home. I heard the front door open, and his footsteps in the hallway, but I remained seated on the couch. "Elise," he whispered quietly, entering the room. I turned to face him, my chest clenching at the expression in his eyes. "I believe I should leave," he replied, his voice firm but tinged with melancholy. "What?" I inquired, my tone barely above a whisper. "This isn't fair to you or Dean," he explained, raking his hand through his hair. "I thought being here would help me figure things out, but it's just made things more confusing." "You don't have to leave," I said hastily, my heart hammering. "Yes, I do," he said, his eyes steadfast. "It's the only way any of us can progress." Tears prickled the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. "Where will you go?" He acknowledged. "I don't know, but I'll figure it out." Dean returned home that evening, his look steely and inscrutable. He hardly glanced at me as he dropped his suitcase down and entered the kitchen. "Have you eaten?" I inquired nervously, following him. "I'm all right," he said abruptly, pouring himself a drink of water. The stillness between us seemed oppressive. I wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the widening divide, but I had no idea where to begin. Finally, he put down his drink and turned to face me. "Do you adore him?" he inquired, his voice soft but full of sadness. I was taken aback by the question, briefly struggling to breathe. "Dean or I began, but the words stuck in my throat. He nodded, his face stiffened. "That is what I thought." The next day, Seb packed his belongings. I stared from the doorway as he packed clothes into a duffel bag, my chest throbbing with each move. When he finished, he turned to face me, his gaze sweet yet determined. "I will miss you," he stated simply. I simply nodded, unable to respond. He stepped forward and barely touched my hand before pulling away. He whispered, "Take care of yourself." Then he was gone. With Seb gone, the home felt more empty than ever. Dean and I went about our days like strangers, exchanging only the absolute minimum of words. The tension between us was terrible, yet none of us appeared willing or capable of resolving it. One evening, as we sat in silence in the living room, Dean spoke out. "I can't do this anymore," he stated quietly but firmly. As I gazed at him, my chest tightened. "What do you mean?" He groaned and ran a hand over his hair. "This marriage, or whatever we've been pretending it is ended, Elise." The remarks hit me hard, but I knew in my heart that he was right. The divorce was completed 3 months later. It was an amicable divorce, but the process was nonetheless difficult. The act of signing the documents was akin to ending a significant phase of my life. I wasn't ready to let it go, even though it had been coming apart for years. I then moved into a modest flat downtown. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, I felt free. A few weeks after my divorce was finalized, I got a letter in the mail. The handwriting on the letter was obvious, and opening it made my heart skip a beat. "Dear Elise, I hope you are well. I have been thinking a lot about you recently and wondering how you are doing. Leaving was the most difficult thing I've ever had to do, but I knew it was the correct decision. I would want to thank you for everything. Thanks for noticing me when no one else did, for believing in me when I was unable to trust in myself. You offered me something I never thought I'd find, a feeling of purpose. I'm doing better now, and I'm working on something I believe you would be pleased of. I hope you find happiness, Elise. You deserved it. Always, Seb." Tears obscured my eyes as I folded the letter and clutched it to my chest. Looking back, I can see how everything unraveled. The decisions I took, the boundaries I broke, stemmed from a place of desire and grief that I didn't completely comprehend at the time. But I've learned to forgive myself, even if others never do. Life is not flawless, and neither are we. But sometimes, in the middle of the turmoil, we discover clarity and the fortitude to begin again.